we are now going to be creating a Clover species, and we're going to start in Photoshop creating the leaves. So what I'm going to do is create a new document. We're going to make the width 256 and the height 512. What we're going to be doing, I'm also going to set my resolution to 72, and let's work in 16-bit. What we're going to do is start by creating half of one of the leaves. There's going to be 3 total. So we'll start with half, and then we'll increase the canvas size and mirror, and then once one complete leaf is done, we're going to just kind of copy it over, and we can make minor changes to it in order to add a bit more realism. So I'm going to start by drawing with the ellipse tool, and I also want to make sure that my snapping is turned on, and I'm going to go ahead and add some guides to a couple of different areas, just the centers, and then starting from the left, we're going to go ahead and draw that out to the extent of the canvas. And the color I'm using, RGB value, is 101 for the red, 120 for the green, and 69 for the blue. So now what I want to do is transform the shape. So I'm going to hit Control T for free transform. We're going to select warp, and what we're going to do is take the lower right and just bring that in, and we could just tweak that just a little bit, pull it down, and start bringing in the other side a little bit. And then we also wanted to kind of dip in at the top a little bit, not too much. So we just need to pull that out a little. And I don't want the top to be so rounded, so I'm going to pull that in, and we don't want it to dip on the bottom, so we'll pull that over a little more. And it might be easier to dip that down after the initial shape using something like the Liquidify tool. And we're just going to pull this in and maybe stretch that out a little. And that should be good to start with. We hit Enter. I'm going to create a duplicate just in case we want to come back to that. But for the most part, we're going to be pretty much sticking with that. So I am going to rasterize the layer. I'm also going to go ahead and convert that other object to a smart object and just turn it off, and that way when I crop it, so C on the keyboard, crop tool, just cropping that out to cut that other shape. The other object's a smart object, so it will not be cropped. We're going to go to the canvas size, and now we're going to increase the width to 512. Oh, and I do want to make sure I go to my background and double click to create a layer out of it first. So now we're going to take this shape and just create a copy And the easiest way to do that is just drag it down to the bottom and highlight over the new layer, and that'll create a duplicate. So now Control T on the keyboard for free transform, and we're going to select flip horizontally. We're just going to move that over. Now this mirror side is really just temporary, really, because we are going to be working still mainly just on the one side, because there's still a lot more to do. What I'm going to do is add another guide, and we want to modify this shape on the right. I'll go ahead and name the layer main leaf, and the other one we'll just call alt side. So what I'm going to do is select the marquee tool, and just highlighting this area here. Control T for free transform, go to warp, and just dip that in. Hit enter. So that's basically going to be the primary shape of the leaf. I am going to just transform this a little bit more. And I just kind of pull that out a little bit. So not a huge change. Now we're going to need a few more horizontal guides, which are going to be our base positions for the different veins that are going to be coming out. So just adding a few in here and keeping the spacing somewhat equal. We can switch over to the move tool to edit the guides. And these are going to be our starting points. And we can turn off that other side for now. What I'm going to do is create a rectangle. And we can use that same green color, that should be fine. And just draw it out to be the size of the guide, or just between the guides. What I also want to do is add this to a group. And we'll go ahead and call that veins. What I also want to do is set up a mask. So I'm going to use just the magic wand tool, selecting the main leaf, and then we can refine the edge. And reduce that radius, and we don't want to smooth it out too much. Click OK, and now select the group and create a quick mask, and then we can invert that. So what I'm also going to do is double click on this shape to open up the layer style. We're going to set up an inner shadow, no distance, just increase our size a bit. We've got the set to multiply. Go ahead and decrease the size a little bit. And we can also set up an outer glow. In precise mode, increase the spread and decrease the size, and then lower the opacity amount. So this, we're also going to need to transform. So Control T for free transform, and we're going to skew and just pull that up. So now we can basically just duplicate this layer and move it down, just overlapping. You can also hold down the Alt key, and with the Move tool, also hold down Shift to constrain, and that'll create a duplicate automatically. And then use the arrow keys if you need to nudge in one direction or the other. It's also a good idea to adjust your layer order so that they're in the correct order. So I'm going to go ahead and just rearrange these to be in the correct order. Should probably moved it down to the bottom first and then worked my way up, and that would order it correctly. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is set up a drop shadow that matches the inner shadow. We do have that outer glow, so we may need to increase the choke and scale to compensate. We'll be able to see it in just a second. For now, I'm just going to turn on drop shadow, turn off the distance. What we've got is 29 for the percent for the opacity, and our size is at 8. So we'll set up our choke, or our spread, to 1%. And then what we can do is copy the layer style, and then select the other layers, right click, and paste the layer style. So now what I want to do is set up some secondary veins, and what we can do is select basically every other shape that we created. Control T on the keyboard, go to warp. You just kind of pull these down. So now you can see those extra veins being created. And that's kind of a cool way to set that up. If you need to set up a layer style, we could lighten or darken in order to ignore the shadows or the outer glow. But this should be good where it's at. For now, I think maybe I will just go ahead and duplicate this entire group and then hide it, and just turning it off for the moment. And that way I can come back, make changes if necessary. So just kind of pull that down and then go over to skipping one and go down to the next. We can also change the layer order after this, which will help disperse the veins a little bit better. So each one that I modified, I'm going to change either up or down and that way we can match that up a little bit better. And then we can continue if you want to add more changes. And that should be good. And I'm going to select the third layer from the top of this group and transform. And it doesn't look like that was the right one, so doing down to the middle and just bringing that in a little bit more. And then we can go to the view mode and turn off show guides. So now we can see a bit more what's going on with the leaf. I'm going to go down to the bottom and we can warp that one in a little bit more. And that looks a little bit better. So I'm going to go through each one and also basically do that same thing where I'm warping more towards this bottom area, really depending on the overlap. It'll look better on some than it will on others. So maybe not everyone needs to be done, but it does make the veins look a little more realistic and kind of blend more correctly. So that we mostly have our layer style and not the green color for each one of these layers. I'm going to go through and take the fill amount and bring it down to 0. And that way we just have the layer style and we do have the fill in. From the original shape. And I'm going to go up to the top and just free transform, moving it down to increase the amount of veins, and then we can distort it. And then warp it. And then we'll do the same thing for the bottom. And this one we can rotate, move that in. So I'm going to go and make another duplicate of the veins. And this time, what I want to do is I think modify our layer style a bit. And so what we can do is duplicate this layer style after we edit it. So double click, I'm going to turn off the drop shadow, inner shadow, and turn up the outer glow all the way up to 100%. Copy that. paste it to all of the other ones. And then we can take all of the layers within the group, selecting all of them, and Control E on the keyboard to merge them all together. So now if I was to invert this, we would see that we just have those veins, because we can add shadows and other things to this afterwards. They're really kind of there more as a starting point and a guide. We could also use a color overlay. With a color just a little bit darker than the current one. Set an outer glow. And we'll use precise. Just add a little bit to that. And that might be a bit much. Now, a lot of these colors are going to be dependent on the side or exactly which map we're creating. So first we'll do the color. So what I'm going to do is take that color overlay and go ahead and lighten it up. Actually, I'm going to just sample from my original color, just lighten it up a tiny bit, and then go back to that main leaf, color overlay, set it to that same color as before, but we'll just darken it. And next we're going to add an inner glow. And the color I've got set up for this is red 187, green 188, and blue 101. And it's got the blend mode set to color dodge. And we can set this to precise or softer, depending on how you want it to look. I think I'm going to use the softer mode. Increase our range a bit. And maybe I'll bring down the opacity just a little. And now if we want to adjust our blending style, we'll need to do that for the different layer styles for the veins. I'm going to rename this layer. And I think I'm going to use either multiply or the linear burn to get that in there. And then I'm going to set up a drop shadow, turn off the use global light, and set the angle to -90. Add a little bit of distance. And size and spread. And then I'm going to change this to a different color, going more towards bluer. And then we're going to use darker color as our blend. And I think I'm going to go back to that color overlay and maybe make that a little less saturated. And then if we adjust the overall fill amount, we start to see a little bit closer to what the final result's going to be for the color map, because we're not going to want it to be all the way up. Because for the most part it's going to be fairly even. But just enough to pull out details. And then we're going to be adding finer details to it as well. Now we're going to set up some more color variation for the main leaf. And what we're going to do is create a new layer. And we can just fill it in. I'm going to pull it out of the group for now. So just using the paint bucket to fill it in. Doesn't matter what color, because just making sure that your colors are set as they were before. We're going to go to Render, Fibers, and adjust the vibrance and the strength. Click OK. And then what we're going to do is Control T, free transform, and just rotate it 90 degrees. You could also go up to image adjustments and rotate it. So we need another layer. And what I'm going to do is just do basically the same thing, except remove the fill this time. Don't run fibers. Set up a gradient overlay. And set it to radial. Reverse it and increase the size a little bit. And I'm going to move this one below the fibers layer and change fibers over to vivid light. And then we're going to just use levels. And adjust that to give us a nice blend that we can use. And then I'm going to go up to the top to filter, blur, motion blur, set the angle to 0, and we can just blur that out and give us some nice lines. And I think I'm actually going to go ahead over to that bottom layer where we've got the gradient and change that to reflected and set the angle to 0. It'll give us a little more range. And then if you want, you can also go into the gradient, where we just have the typical gradient, and we can ease that in a little bit more, just that midpoint. And we're probably going to end up using this as a mask, so we can actually adjust our intensity a bit more and set it up for what would be ended up being black and white. We're going to select these two layers now and Control E to merge them. Now we only need half, but I'm going to save the other half just because it is different. and we don't want to have identical features on both sides, so we'll hang on to that for the moment and create a duplicate. And now I'm going to go to Image Adjustments and Black and White, and now we can fine-tune the map and what's going to be our mask. And what we're going to be doing is just kind of mixing together different colors within the leaf. Now using the black and white, starting with a color is really nice, because then you can adjust saturation values and different tones. And then when you get to the black and white filter or adjustment, you get a little more control over the mask. That should be good right there. And if you want to save that, you can. I usually end up with a lot of duplicate layers just because you never really know what you're going to need to go back for if something goes wrong. So what I'm going to set up for this is add in a guide to the center, which we already have one. Adding a guide turned our guides back on. And I'm going to set up the marquee tool and just draw out to this right section and mask it. Just so we can edit the one side and see it a little easier to match it up. Go back, View, Show, turn off the guides. So I'm going to turn down the opacity of this just enough to get an overlay, and then selecting the main layer, Control T to free transform. We're going to select Skew, and we want this to basically match our vein direction. So then we can also warp it. And I'm going to pull in the lower left point. And we do want to make sure we're still centered. We do have the mask and the other section linked, which may not have been the best idea. So I'm going to unlink them and go back and just do that again. So skew, we can just move it down. Because before we were destroying the mask and the main layer, and we just want to distort this layer. So now we can go to warp. And kind of fit that in a little better. And that should be good. So now we're going to use this to control our color. There's a little bit of pixelation. We can clean that up a little later. I'm just going to use marquee tool. Select that area. You can copy. So Control C, and then I'm going to create a new group from layer with the main leaf selected. Just call it main leaf. Add a quick mask. Go to the mask in the channels, turn it on, and then hit paste. And it does look like it is not, or it is off from where it should be. So we're going to go back to the history, get rid of paste, and disable the layer mask. Copy, and paste that in. Okay, so now we can create a duplicate of the main leaf. And bring it outside, or just underneath the main leaf group. And then we can modify our alternate colors. So go to that color overlay, and we can actually just turn off the color overlay and modify our inner glow. And we may just leave it on color dodge for now and set up another layer or group to modify. So we'll duplicate that main leaf group, and I'm going to invert the mask. So select the mask and Control I, and then we can turn off the inner glow and choose a new color overlay. And we can go a little more towards the blue spectrum with this one. So I've got red 65, green 91, and blue 39. And then we can change over our layer style. Let's go ahead and try vivid light. There we go, that's looking much better. And I'm going to set the opacity to 20. And we could even set and change that overall blend if needed. And just kind of take a look at what is being changed. So I think I'm going to go to that layer that's just outside, and if I turn it off I get a nice color variation. I don't want it that intense, but what I can do is turn back on the color overlay and lighten it up. And then we can just adjust that. So I'm going to go up into the first main leaf group and adjust the opacity of that layer a little. Just turning it down. We can also go into the mask and start creating some variations on the masks. And that way we can mix them a lot more. And I'm going to reduce the white output just a little. Now our veins aren't really showing up as much with these new changes. So we'll go to the vein layer and we can increase that overall opacity. And go into the styles if needed to make any changes. And now I'm just going to turn on outer glow and set that color to my lighter color of my original pics. And just increase the opacity a bit. And the spread. And I'm going to switch this over to color dodge. And then reduce the opacity amount. Kind of adjust that range until it looks good. Reduce our spread. And that looks like it should work pretty well. And now I'm going to take the bottom layer and just create a quick mask for it. First, I'm going to take the bottom layer and add a layer style color overlay of white. And just fill it in all the way. And then create a mask for this. I'm going to create a new layer, fill it in, do a gradient overlay, radial, actually we might be able to do reflected. Or even maybe just linear. Actually, we'll stick with radial. Make it a little larger. And we might not even need to make a mask if we can get this to look good without it. Although I do think I'm losing too many details. So I'm going to switch this gradient over to hard mix, and I think I will use linear. Scale it up. Increase the opacity, and that should be good. I'm going to go ahead and save a new version of this, and I think at this point I might be able to maybe merge this down. unless we want to do any further editing. But that should be good. So I'm going to select all of these layers, and one thing we could do is convert it to a smart object, and that way we could still open and go back to that document state later. So if we edit it, it's going to open a new document with all of those layers. I'm now going to create a duplicate of the veins at the current state, and then take these two and convert to a smart object. And then go back to these veins, and we can turn off some of these layer styles. Drop shadow, outer glow. Just go to our color overlay, lighten it up, to almost white, and then reduce just a little. Now I'm going to grab this vein layer and place just above it an exposure. And then we can adjust and fine-tune it just before reaching those veins. So I have my exposure set to -0.8, offsets -0.0026, and gamma at 1.27. And I'm going to add in vibrance. And we're going to decrease the vibrance, or actually decrease saturation, and increase vibrance a little. And then also add in just a solid color. And I am going to go ahead and actually change that color and darken it. And first, go ahead and set that to 100% opacity and just darken it. So now we can kind of blend that in with our finer details. And we'll just go ahead and create a duplicate. And flip horizontal. Move it over. And we need to do the same things with the veins. Now there's a bit of a difference between the two, and it probably has to do with one of the gradients. So what I'm going to do is create a mask for the duplicate layer. Snapping should be turned down, so I'm going to transform the selection. It should snap to the center. If not, we'll get it as close as possible. And then create a quick mask. I'm just going to invert it. I'm going to unlink it and transform and just move it over to get it to match. So I also want to have a center line. So what I'm going to do is create a rectangle, and we're going to go up higher into the group to where our veins are at, just above it, and add just a rectangle in here. And then I'm going to go ahead and free transform using perspective to just narrow it, and then warp to just pull out the sides a little bit on the top, and then we can squish it down maybe a little bit more. And just transform that top portion. And then we can move it up just to match. What I'm going to do next, set a color overlay to be around what we've got for the rest of the veins. And then I'm going to set up an outer glow, set it to vivid light, and this is going to be for increasing the saturation just a bit around the center. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And I will need to adjust the range, anti-alias, maybe use a precise blend. And that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to just clean up some of this other stuff, some of the older things for now. Just grabbing all of these that are hidden for the moment, adding them to a new group, calling it back. Just turn it off. And that way it just cleans it up a little bit more. The veins, I think I'm going to group. And put those all together. And I'm going to be modifying that center stem a little bit. Just going to layer style, inner shadow, distance to 0, and changing the color to a darker tone. And we'll do a linear burn. And then we could also set a drop shadow. And just have it dip in a little bit. Change the contour. And I'm going to free transform it and make it even thinner. Which means that inner shadow needs to come down. Now if we go to the veins layer, we can fine-tune our blend. I don't really want to lose the saturation, so I think it's going to be a matter of going in to some of the other settings and getting those to mix a little bit more. So we'll go ahead and set this to 70. I'm going to set our other one to 70 as well. I'm also going to go ahead and go to our duplicate side and just see if we can warp it. And we will have to set up a new mask for the layer, which we'll do with a group, but just to have it so it's different than the other side. So we're going to use, we can just duplicate this veins. First add that to a group, duplicate the veins, and just pull that mask off and use it down lower. And then we can delete that duplicate layer. So we got a little bit of change now, which means the veins should also probably be modified a little bit. And that should work out pretty well. And the next thing I want to do is create the sort of triangular strip down the center. For that, if we go back to our back in the backup layers, we can actually use this one in order to create that. So we'll go ahead and copy it, and that way we don't have to go through all the process again, because that'll work just fine. All we need to do is rotate it around. I'm going to set it to lighten. And then we're also going to free transform. And it should match the background veins that we have in the strips. So we'll just adjust that. And I'm going to set a color overlay. Set it to lighter color. Might work. We might have to adjust the way this is being created. Whether or not we, in other words, use a mask instead, because we could just use this as a mask, which will probably be the better way to go. So I'm just going to cancel this for the moment. We do need another one for the other side. So I'm just going to copy that, Control T, and flip horizontal. We can just move it down so that it's different. We'll also, actually we will flip it vertically. And we'll just rotate ourselves around a bit. I'm kind of losing track of the transformation, so I'm going to undo that and just rotate it this time. Holding down Shift while I do it So I should be able to maintain the angle. I'm going to go ahead and create a guide and use it as a reference. Mark and set this up so that it starts a little bit above the center point, around right here. The other one do the same. And then their endpoints I do want changed a little bit. And that should be good. I might need to narrow it, but I can do that afterwards. So I do need to cut out and kind of mask these before I merge them. So we'll just marquee, use the rectangular marquee tool, mask it, invert if needed. And then we'll go ahead and we'll group those. And we're not going to worry about cutting off the edges just yet. I can free transform the entire group. I could do perspective. I do want to change sort of the pivot location of the transformation, and this little point that shows up in the center, and just kind of move that to the center, and that way it's performing the actions to that center point. So we're going to move that in just a little, and go back to free transform, bring it up, and then I'm going to actually go back to perspective and change that just a little. That should be good. So we'll stick with that. What I'm going to do is change these blending styles to normal. Add a new layer underneath. And set a color overlay of black. Fill it in. And then we could just merge those all together. So this is going to be our mask. We'll probably modify the levels a little bit. And then we're going to set up a new layer. And we'll just fill it with the lighter color for now. Go ahead and Control A to select all and copy from that mask layer. Add a mask. Go to the channel for the mask, select it, and paste it in. And I'm going to go to our guides, or view, and turn the guides off. So now we can make more modifications to this and modify the mask if needed. One thing we could do is using the Smudge Tool. Increase the hardness, and I'm going to change brush type. And change the shape. You can really use just about anything, just as long as it's not a standard shape. of just a circle. I'm going to use one of my 16-bit brushes. It's a little too round, so I'll go ahead and switch to a different one. And just kind of shift those around, and then go into the center, kind of mix that up a bit. We're going to end up putting this below the main vein. Go ahead and open up the veins layer. And then I can go into that one and that main vein and just reduce that setting a little bit. So I'm going to go into that mask, go back to levels, and we can just fine-tune it. Maybe make it a little bit sharper. And I want a little more variation, so I'm going to create a duplicate of this layer and drag the mask onto the group itself. We can then turn off this other layer and then modify this mask to give us more variation. So what I want to do is go to Blur, Surface Blur. We'll change our threshold. And what we're just trying to do is get something we can work with for a better contrast. And by blurring it, we should be able to get some higher peak areas and some lower ones. And that way we can make patches that'll show up. Now you could also go in and manually paint in different changes. We could go in and set this to burn highlights. I'm going to go ahead and select one of my brushes. And these brushes are from the 1500 Alpha Brush collection. Some of them brought into Photoshop as a 16-bit brush. They work out pretty well. So I think we're going to use that. And after you make certain changes, you can go back and adjust levels again and pull out more variation, making it harder, basically, a harder edge. And that way you don't have to spend too much time painting it. You can just drag in a slider. We could also, instead of using levels, set up brightness and contrast and just increase the contrast a bit. So we're going to be adding just a couple more things to the leaf, setting up brush paths for the edge, and then we're going to go ahead and combine it and get all our maps together in the next section.